James Whittaker pressed his boarding pass between his fingers as he walked through the jet bridge, trying to suppress a yawn. The hour was late, the fluorescent lights overhead too harsh, and the shuffle of tired passengers around him only emphasized his own exhaustion. He had been awake for nearly 20 hours, wrapping up deadlines in his Manhattan office, and now he was heading to Los Angeles for a meeting he barely cared about. His boss had called it an opportunity. James, however, saw it as another obligation that kept him running while his life remained ordinary, uneventful, and invisible. He stepped into the narrow aisle of the aircraft, nodded at the attendant greeting passengers, and moved slowly down the rows until his seat appeared. Row 11, Seat A, a window seat. Normally, he preferred the aisle, where he could stretch his legs and slip out without disturbing anyone. But tonight, he didn't mind being tucked away. He only wanted to close his eyes and let the monotonous hum of the engines lull him to sleep. He slid into the seat, resting his bag beneath the chair in front of him. The air smelled faintly of recycled coffee and disinfectant. Around him, people murmured, fastening belts, scrolling through phones. A child across the aisle clutched a stuffed dinosaur, his mother trying to settle him. A businessman a few rows up typed furiously on his laptop, fingers moving so quickly they seemed mechanical. To James, none of them mattered. They were strangers, and in a few hours they would scatter into the night, returning to lives he would never know. He was just another anonymous traveler among them. When the captain's voice announced taxiing, James leaned his head against the cool plastic wall beside the window. His eyes grew heavy. He thought briefly of his apartment in Brooklyn, the half-empty fridge, the laundry waiting to be folded, the unpaid bills on his desk. It was a quiet, unremarkable life. He wasn't married, had no children, and though his coworkers were polite, he knew they'd never describe him as unforgettable. That thought, oddly, gave him comfort. Being unnoticed meant he was safe. Nobody meant there was no weight of expectation. The plane roared onto the runway, engines pulling them into the sky. He felt his chest press back against the seat as the lights of the city blurred below. Soon, the ascent leveled, and the cabin filled with the soft chatter of passengers retrieving headphones and opening books. James barely noticed. The vibration of the plane and the low thrum of the engines acted like a lullaby, pulling him into a shallow, restless sleep. Dreams came in fragments. His father teaching him how to drive. The smell of his mother's apple pie cooling on a windowsill. A college memory of flying in a simulator, the joystick clutched tightly in his sweaty hands, laughing nervously with friends as they pretended to land jumbo jets they had no business flying. That memory stuck oddly in his dream, replaying itself as though it had importance. He heard the words of the instructor. Stay calm. Always trust your instruments. Panic is what kills, not mistakes. He had forgotten that lesson long ago. Tonight, his mind was dragging it back to him. In the cabin, life unfolded quietly while he slept. Flight attendants pushed the beverage cart, offering drinks with practiced smiles. Passengers tucked headphones into ears, laughter from a comedy spilling faintly into the aisle. A couple clinked their plastic wine cups together, celebrating a getaway. To anyone glancing toward row 11, James looked like any other tired traveler, head leaned against the wall, arms folded loosely across his chest, lost in dreams no one else would ever know. But outside, the sky was changing. Pockets of turbulence whispered through the fuselage, causing the wings to sway. Clouds thickened, hiding the moon, and the occasional rumble of distant thunder flickered against the horizon. A storm had been forecast, but the crew believed they could skirt its edge. Passengers barely noticed the bumps, though some clutched armrests a little tighter. James remained oblivious, carried deeper into slumber, his breathing steady. In his dream, the simulator returned again. He was older this time, no longer a college kid messing around, but himself, as he was tonight. He sat in the cockpit, controls before him, warning alarms blaring. The instructor's voice wasn't playful anymore. It was stern, commanding. You can do this, James. Trust yourself. Trust the instruments. His fingers twitched in his sleep, as though remembering the feel of a yoke. His brow furrowed. Somewhere inside him, his subconscious was rehearsing for a role he never believed he'd need to play. Minutes passed. The cabin lights dimmed as passengers drifted toward their own uneasy rest. The hum of engines was constant, reassuring. Yet, a sense of fragility hovered in the air, as if the night sky itself held secrets it was not ready to reveal. James stirred slightly, shifting in his seat, but did not wake. To the world around him, he was invisible, a middle-aged man lost in sleep, no different than 1,000 others who had occupied row 11 on flights before. Yet destiny has a way of hiding greatness in the most unassuming of places. For now, James remained a nobody, his name unspoken, his presence unremarked. But every second drew him closer to the moment when the quiet ordinary would be shattered by urgency, when the anonymity of row 11 would vanish, and his life would tilt into the extraordinary. The passengers around him could not know that the man dozing beside the window would soon be their only hope. They only saw him as another face among many, wrapped in dreams. The crew could not know that their safety would rest in his hands. Even James himself did not yet understand. For now, he dreamed of simulators, of voices reminding him not to panic. For now, he remained asleep, unaware of the storm gathering not just outside the aircraft, but inside the fragile chain of fate that bound every life aboard. The seatbelt sign flickered briefly as turbulence rattled the plane. Some passengers shifted uneasily. A stewardess glanced down the aisle, her eyes briefly resting on the man in row 11. She noticed nothing unusual, just another weary traveler asleep. She moved on, not realizing she had looked upon the person who would soon decide the fate of every passenger on the aircraft. James exhaled heavily, shifting again, pressing his head deeper into the wall. His body was weary, but his dreams were restless. In his subconscious, alarms continued to blare, voices instructed him, and unseen. Forces pulled him closer to awakening. The night outside grew darker, lightning flashing in jagged bursts across the horizon. The captain adjusted controls, mindful of the storm's shifting path. In the cabin, drinks rattled on trays, a baby cried, and nervous whispers began to spread. Still, James slept. The storm was coming. And soon, so was the call that would change everything. The cabin lights glowed in muted amber, casting long shadows against the overhead bins as the aircraft pushed westward through the night. James shifted faintly in his sleep, his breath steady, his head leaning against the window. Outside, the storm had thickened, gray towers of clouds swallowing the moon. Lightning flashed intermittently, jagged spears illuminating the wings, followed by deep rumbles that vibrated faintly through the fuselage. Passengers stirred uneasily, some gripping armrests, others pulling blankets closer, pretending not to notice the turbulence. Then, without warning, a sharp crackle burst from the speakers overhead. The intercom whined, and a strained voice filled the cabin. "Ladies and gentlemen." The captain's tone was low, but there was something unusual in it. Not the rehearsed calm of a standard announcement, but a weight that seemed to hang on every syllable. "This is your captain speaking. We are experiencing an onboard emergency. If there are any licensed pilots on board, please make yourself known immediately." For a heartbeat, the cabin froze in absolute silence. The words seemed to hang in the air, heavy, and incomprehensible. Passengers glanced at one another, confusion flickering across faces, as if no one could believe what they had just heard. Then came the murmurs. "What did he just say?" whispered a woman in row 14, clutching her husband's hand. "Pilots? Did he say pilots?" Another passenger echoed, his voice cracking with disbelief. Phones appeared, screens lighting up, as if a connection to the outside world might clarify what was happening at 35,000 feet. The flight attendants exchanged anxious looks, their smiles forced and brittle as they moved quickly down the aisle, whispering among themselves. James stirred, half waking, his mind groggy, caught between the haze of sleep and the jagged clarity of adrenaline. The words reached him slowly, echoing in his brain. "Any pilots on board?" His heart skipped, then thudded heavily. He blinked, trying to shake the weight of exhaustion, staring at the seat back in front of him as if it held the answers. Around him, tension mounted. A young man in row 9 stood up abruptly, muttering, "Is this some kind of joke?" A flight attendant quickly urged him to sit, her hand trembling slightly as she pushed him back into his seat. Children began to whimper. A baby cried. The airplane rattled again, turbulence tossing cups and rattling trays. The captain's voice returned, sharper now, with urgency that couldn't be disguised. "Again, if there are any trained pilots on this aircraft, please press your call button immediately. We are in need of assistance." Gasps filled the air. Nervous laughter from a few passengers fizzled quickly into silence. A woman covered her mouth with her hand, eyes wide. Someone whispered, "This can't be real." Yet deep down every person knew it was. James felt the blood drain from his face. His mind rushed back to the dream, the simulator, the voice that told him to stay calm. He tried to convince himself he was imagining things, that surely a trained pilot would speak up any moment. He waited. Seconds stretched, but the cabin remained a sea of frightened faces, all waiting for someone else to respond. No one moved. No one answered. The weight of silence pressed against James's chest like a physical force. He shifted in his seat, breathing unevenly. His rational brain screamed at him, "You're not a pilot. Stay seated. This isn't your responsibility." But somewhere deeper, another voice, quieter, steadier, whispered, "What if no one else can?" He closed his eyes, memories colliding in rapid flashes. The years he had spent fascinated with aviation, reading manuals, logging hours in advanced simulators that mimicked cockpit controls. He had dismissed it as a hobby, something to fill quiet weekends. Now, those same memories clawed at him like they'd been training him for this very moment. A commotion broke out near the front of the cabin. A passenger, frantic, demanded answers. From a stewardess. Her reply was hushed but urgent. "The first officer is unwell," she said, voice cracking, "and the captain is injured." The man recoiled, sinking back into his seat. Around them, panic spread like ripples in water. James felt his hands tremble as he gripped the armrests. The captain's announcement hadn't been a mistake, hadn't been a drill. This plane was in crisis. The stewardess nearest to him, a woman with dark hair pulled into a tight bun, paused briefly in the aisle. Her eyes swept across the passengers, scanning faces, desperate for a volunteer. When her gaze landed on James, she lingered a moment longer. Maybe she saw something in him, the way he sat forward now, awake and alert, as though fighting with himself. Their eyes locked for a fraction of a second. She moved on, but the connection was enough. James's throat tightened. He wasn't just imagining his responsibility anymore. He could feel it circling him like a storm. The whispers around him grew louder, frantic. "What's happening? Who's flying the plane?" Someone muttered, "Are we going to crash?" Another asked, their voice trembling. James couldn't take it anymore. He unclipped his seatbelt and rose slightly, only to sit back down as fear crushed him again. What if he was wrong? What if stepping forward only made things worse? He wasn't a licensed pilot. He wasn't supposed to be anyone's savior. And yet, silence still reigned. He looked at the child with the stuffed dinosaur, now clutching it tightly against his chest, his mother rocking him gently, though her own face betrayed terror. He looked at the elderly couple across the aisle, hands clasped, whispering prayers to each other. He looked at the businessman who had been typing earlier, his laptop now forgotten as his eyes stared blankly ahead. In that moment, James realized what was at stake. These weren't strangers anymore. They were lives. Human lives depending on someone, anyone, to respond. He inhaled sharply, steadying his breath. The memory of the simulator instructor came again, clear as if spoken into his ear. Stay calm. Trust the instruments. Panic kills, not mistakes. For the first time, James wondered if his life of invisibility had been preparing him for this moment. The storm outside roared, the plane rattled again, and the call from the captain still echoed in the cabin. Any pilots on board? James clenched his fists. He was still nobody. But maybe tonight, being nobody would no longer be enough. The cabin was unraveling. It began slowly, like a thread tugged loose, then unraveled all at once. A second announcement from the captain confirmed what everyone feared. Something was terribly wrong. The passengers no longer whispered. They spoke in rising, frantic tones, voices layered one on top of another, filling the aircraft with a low roar of anxiety. Is anyone going to answer him? A man near the back demanded. Somebody has to know how to fly this thing. Another cried, her hands shaking violently as she clutched the seat back in front of her. A baby's wail pierced through, shrill and endless. A young mother tried to rock the child, her own face drained of color. The businessman who had been typing earlier now stood, gesturing wildly at a flight attendant. Tell us what's happening. He barked. What's wrong? With the pilots? The attendant's calm mask cracked. She tried to reassure him, but her words were hollow, her smile too forced. We are assessing the situation, sir. Please remain calm. Remain calm. The phrase only ignited more panic. The plane jolted violently, turbulence slamming luggage against overhead bins with a loud thud. A chorus of gasps swept through the cabin. Passengers gripped their armrests, knuckles white. One woman began to pray aloud, whispering hurried words as if speed alone could make God listen faster. James sat frozen in row 11, his chest tight, heart pounding against his ribs like a fist demanding release. The panic around him spread like fire, and he could feel it creeping into him, threatening to consume what little composure he had left. Yet in that chaos, something unusual stirred deep inside him. Amid the fear, amid the storm and the cries and the shaking fuselage, a strange clarity began to form. His eyes scanned the cabin. Every face told a story: fear, desperation, disbelief. The elderly man 2 rows ahead clutched his wife's hand so tightly her knuckles turned pale. The teenager by the window muttered to himself, rocking back and forth, earbuds dangling uselessly from his ears. The child with the stuffed dinosaur was now sobbing quietly, the toy damp from tears. James felt his throat tighten. These weren't just passengers anymore. These were lives, fragile, irreplaceable, relying on someone to act. But still, no one moved. The call from the captain still echoed in his ears. Any pilots on board? The silence that followed had been deafening. Not a single hand raised, not a single voice answered. Surely, among 200 people, there had to be someone. A former pilot, a military officer, a hobbyist more qualified than him. Anyone. But the minutes stretched, and the silence remained. A sudden, sharp voice cut through the chaos. "A passenger in first class," his words tinged with accusation. "We're all going to die if nobody does something. Is there really no one here who knows how to fly?" The words hung heavy, pressing down on everyone. Heads turned, eyes darted, searching faces for the faintest sign of competence. For a hero. For a savior. James felt their eyes sweep over him, and then past him, dismissing him like the invisible man he had always been. He was just another office worker, another weary traveler. He looked ordinary because he was ordinary. And yet, his hands itched. His mind raced back to the simulator, to the controls, to the hours he had spent immersing himself in aviation. He wasn't licensed, but he knew more than anyone else likely did. Do something the quiet voice inside urged. Stay quiet, another voice hissed back. You'll only make things worse. The plane shuddered again, dipping suddenly before stabilizing. A scream ripped through the cabin. The businessman clutched his armrest, face pale with terror. People began unbuckling seatbelts, standing despite the seatbelt sign, pacing the aisle as if movement could chase away doom. Flight attendants tried to push them back, their own panic barely contained. Chaos now had a face. James's hands trembled as he gripped his knees. He felt like he was watching from the outside, a spectator in a nightmare. Yet every second he hesitated, the danger grew. Another announcement crackled overhead, the captain's voice weaker this time. "We require assistance immediately. If anyone has training, even basic, please come forward." It wasn't just a call anymore. It was a plea. And for James, it was unbearable. He looked down at his hands, palms slick with sweat. He thought of his father's words long ago, when James was just a boy, afraid to dive off the high board at the pool. Courage isn't about not being afraid, son. It's about doing it while you're afraid. He swallowed hard. That same fear gripped him now, heavier than ever, but so did the memory of that voice. Passengers shouted over each other. Some demanded answers. Others demanded miracles. The storm outside lashed against the plane, rattling windows, thunder booming so close it felt as if the sky itself was breaking apart. James unclipped his seatbelt slowly, the click drowned out by the cacophony around him. He rose slightly, knees trembling, then sat back down, overcome by doubt. Who was he to think he could do this? He was nobody. A man who filed reports, chased deadlines, lived quietly and invisibly. He wasn't meant for this kind of stage. And yet, in the deepest part of his mind, another truth gnawed at him. Maybe all those years of anonymity had been preparation. Maybe destiny had been quietly shaping him, not for fame or fortune, but for this singular moment. The stewardess with the dark hair passed again, her face pale. James reached out impulsively, catching her sleeve. She turned, startled, her eyes searching his. "I'm not a pilot," James said, voice low but steady. "But I've had training. Simulators. A lot of hours. I know procedures. I can help." For a moment, disbelief flickered across her face. Then something else, relief, fragile and desperate, sparked in her eyes. She nodded quickly, whispering, "Stay ready." As she moved forward to the cockpit, James sank back into his seat, heart pounding harder than ever. His confession was out. He couldn't take it back. The gears of fate had shifted. Around him, the chaos continued, a storm within a storm. Passengers argued, prayed, sobbed. The plane shook again, oxygen masks jiggling in their compartments, though not yet deployed. The air felt thin, electric, charged with fear. But amid the noise, James felt something unexpected stirring within him. Not calm exactly, not bravery, but resolve. He knew the next few minutes would define everything. The cabin had not quieted. If anything, the storm outside seemed to have seeped into the passengers themselves. Every rattle of the fuselage drew cries. Every flicker of lightning cast long, trembling shadows across faces drained of color. The air inside was hot with breath and panic, stifling in its closeness. James sat in row 11, heart hammering in his chest, still tasting the words he had whispered to the stewardess moments earlier. I can help. They felt surreal, like they belonged to someone else. He hadn't planned to speak. The words had slipped out of him almost involuntarily, as if his mouth knew before his mind did. Now there was no retreat. The stewardess reappeared moments later. Her face was paler than before, her bun slightly loosened from rushing between panicked passengers. She bent toward him, her voice a hurried whisper. The captain wants to see you. Right now. James blinked, disbelieving. The weight of the moment slammed into him like turbulence. His instinct screamed to protest, to shake his head, to tell her she had misunderstood. But her eyes held his firmly, wide with urgency and just a hint of hope. She needed him to say, yes. His mouth went dry. I'm not, he began, but she cut him off. There's no one else, she said. Her voice was tight, almost breaking. It's you or no one. The words dug into his chest, deeper than any fear. He swallowed hard. The cabin seemed to tilt, not from turbulence, but from the enormity of what she had just said. Passengers nearby had overheard. A ripple spread through the rows. Faces turned toward him, curious, desperate, suspicious. He's going up? Someone whispered. That guy? Another muttered incredulously. James could feel the heat of their stares on his back. For years he had lived unnoticed, a quiet shadow in offices, in bars, in life itself. Now suddenly, he was under the weight of 200 pairs of eyes. Their judgment pressed down on him, their hope suffocating. He rose to his feet slowly, his legs stiff, knees weak. The aisle stretched before him like a gauntlet. As he stepped into it, he heard murmurs rise louder. Do you think he knows what he's doing? God help us if he doesn't. The child with the stuffed dinosaur peered up at him, eyes wide and tearful. The elderly woman across the aisle whispered, Bless you. Each step forward felt heavier, as if the carpet itself resisted him. He was walking not just toward the cockpit, but toward a destiny he had never asked for. The stewardess walked beside him, shielding him slightly from the stairs, though even she seemed fragile in the moment. Her hand brushed his arm once, briefly, as if to remind him he wasn't completely alone. But the truth pressed against him. If he failed, they all failed. As they passed row after row, passengers craned their necks to watch. A few reached out, touching his sleeve, as though by brushing against him, they might absorb some reassurance. He offered none. His face was set, but inside he was a storm. Fear, disbelief, resolve colliding in equal measure. The closer they came to the front, the louder the engine seemed to grow, the deeper the tremors of the storm outside. The smell of coffee and faint disinfectant gave way to something sharper, the metallic tang of electronics, the sterile scent of the cockpit just beyond the reinforced door. The stewardess knocked twice, then keyed in a code. With a hiss, the heavy door unsealed. For the first time in his life, James saw the cockpit of a commercial jet in crisis. It was a sight, both awe-inspiring and terrifying. Panels blinked with a forest of lights, some glowing steady, others flashing urgent warnings. The air was thick with the smell of sweat and ozone. The captain sat slumped slightly in his chair, one hand gripping the yoke weakly, his face ashen. His other arm was wrapped awkwardly against his chest, clearly injured. Beside him, the co-pilot's seat was empty. James glimpsed a crew member crouched over the first officer, who was pale and unconscious, an oxygen mask pressed against his face. The captain turned his head slowly, his eyes locking on James with a mix of fatigue and desperate determination. His voice was hoarse when he spoke. "You're the one with training?" James hesitated, every instinct telling him to correct the record. Not real training, not professional, just simulators. But the words stuck in his throat. "Yes," he said finally, though his voice shook. "Not licensed. But I've logged hours on advanced simulators. I know procedures." The captain studied him for a beat that stretched like an eternity. Then, with a curt nod, he motioned to the empty co-pilot's seat. "That'll have to do. Sit down." James froze. The seat might as well have been a throne of fire. Sitting there meant crossing a line he could never retreat from. His legs refused to move, every nerve in his body screaming at him to stop. The captain's voice hardened. "Son, we don't have the luxury of hesitation. Sit down." The command broke through his paralysis. With a deep, shaky breath, James slid into the co-pilot's chair. The leather was warm, molded by countless professionals before him, men and women who had trained years for this. His hands hovered uncertainly over the controls, fingers twitching. The blinking lights, the steady hum of machinery, the weight of the storm outside, it all pressed down at once. The captain's voice cut through. "Look at me. Forget the fear. We'll do this step by step. I'll guide. You'll execute. Clear?" James nodded weakly. His throat was too dry for words. Behind him, the stewardess slipped quietly out, closing the cockpit door. The sound of it latching was final, sealing him inside. The roar of passengers dulled instantly, replaced by the unrelenting drone of engines and the occasional warning chime. He was no longer James Whittaker, invisible man from row 11. He was now part of the cockpit. For a moment, he sat frozen, staring at the horizon on the glowing screen before him. Lightning flashed outside, illuminating the cockpit in stark white. His reflection in the glass startled him, sweat beading on his forehead, eyes wide, lips pressed in a thin line. He looked like a man trapped in a nightmare. The captain spoke again, calmer this time, as if sensing James's need for grounding. "What's your name?" "James?" he croaked. "James," the captain repeated, steady. "You're not. Here by accident. You understand? The wrong man doesn't stand up in times like this. You did. Now you're here. So focus." The words struck James like a lifeline. He inhaled deeply, filling his lungs with recycled air that still felt like a first real breath he had taken all night. His trembling slowed, though only slightly. He reached forward, fingers brushing against the yoke. The controls felt alien and familiar all at once, like shaking hands with an old acquaintance he hadn't expected to meet again. This was it. The man who had boarded the plane as a nobody in row 11 was gone. The storm had called him forward, and destiny had answered. For the first time in his life, James understood. The unknown wasn't something to fear. It was something to recognize, accept, and step into, even when every instinct screamed to turn back. And he was already inside. The door sealed behind James with a heavy metallic click, muffling the rising storm of panic in the cabin. For a moment, he sat in the co-pilot's chair as though it were a dream. The cockpit stretched before him like an alien world, an ocean of switches, gauges, and blinking lights. Screens glowed with streams of numbers he half understood, their steady rhythm occasionally interrupted by the angry flash of warning indicators. The hum of the engines vibrated through the walls, constant and unrelenting, like a reminder that the machine was alive and waiting for command. His hands hovered over the controls, trembling, hesitant to touch. He had spent years with simulators, gripping plastic yokes, staring at computer monitors, laughing at small mistakes, or restarting after crashes that carried no consequence. But this wasn't a game. The weight of hundreds of lives sat directly behind him. Every breath they drew, tied to the movements of his hands. The captain's voice snapped him from his spiral. "Don't freeze up on me, James. We're in this together." James turned. The captain's face was pale, beads of sweat glistening on his forehead. One arm pressed awkwardly against his chest. Pain shadowed his eyes, but his voice remained firm, authoritative. It was the only anchor in this storm. "I need your hands, your focus," the captain continued. "I'll guide, you'll act. Clear?" James nodded, throat too dry for words. He forced his hands to lower onto the yoke, the leather worn smooth from years of use. It felt heavier than he expected, as though gravity itself pressed against. Good," the captain said. "Now listen carefully. Keep her level. Watch the artificial horizon." James's eyes darted to the instrument panel. The glowing blue and brown display showed the aircraft's nose slightly dipping, wings wobbling against turbulence. Instinct surged through him, drawn from muscle memory. He eased the yoke back, steadying the nose, correcting the roll. The plane responded, sluggish but obedient, leveling out. The captain's eyes flicked to the monitor, then back to James. "Not bad." The words were small, but they landed like a lifeline. For the first time, James felt a sliver of control, a thread to hold on to amid chaos. A groan came from behind them. James glanced over his shoulder and caught sight of the first officer. Still unconscious, his chest rose faintly under the oxygen mask, his face waxy and gray. A paramedic crouched beside him, monitoring, but the scene only underscored the brutal truth. The cockpit had only one functioning pilot and a passenger plucked from row 11. The radio crackled. A voice. "From air traffic control. Flight 289. We read your distress. Confirm. Do you have a qualified pilot on board?" The captain leaned toward the mic, wincing as he adjusted his injured arm. "Negative. Only myself and an unlicensed trainee with simulator hours. Request immediate vector guidance to nearest safe approach." Silence followed, then the reply, slower, waited. "Copy. Flight 289. Maintain current heading. Will clear airspace around you. Stand by." James's chest tightened. To hear himself described in such clinical terms, unlicensed trainee, stripped him of the fragile confidence he had been piecing together. His hands tightened on the yoke, knuckles pale. The captain glanced at him, reading the doubt in his face. "Don't listen to that. You've got this. I wouldn't let you sit here if I didn't believe it." James forced a nod, though the words barely registered above the thundering in his chest. The cockpit lurched as turbulence struck again, rattling controls. Warning alarms chimed, piercing and urgent. Instinct screamed at him to flinch, to release the yoke, but the captain barked, "Hold steady." James gritted his teeth, pulling gently against the shaking, eyes fixed on the artificial horizon. The plane wobbled, but slowly, agonizingly. Steadied. Sweat poured down his temple, dripping onto his collar. His breath came ragged, shallow, but the instruments obeyed. "Good," the captain muttered again, softer this time. "You're keeping us alive." The words landed heavier than the storm itself. James's stomach twisted. Was he really? Or was he moments away from killing everyone on board? The captain leaned back, grimacing. His injured arm trembled with the effort of holding controls earlier. He was relying on James more than ever, and both of them knew it. "All right, James," the captain said, his tone more instructional now. "We're going to trim for altitude. Throttles here, feel it? Adjust gently. Small corrections, nothing sudden. Breathe with the plane." James swallowed, reached out, and wrapped his fingers around the throttle levers. The power of the engine surged through the metal, vibrating into his hand. He eased them forward, watching the needle climb, then adjusted back, finding a fragile balance. The plane responded, nose lifting slightly, turbulence smoothing for a brief moment. The cockpit lights glowed steady, warnings blinking but less. Frantic, James exhaled, only then realizing he had been holding his breath. "See?" the captain said, eyes still locked on him. "She'll listen to you if you respect her. Not too much. Not too little. You're in command now, James. Accept it." The words rang in his ears. "You're in command." He shook his head instinctively. "I'm not. I can't." "You can," the captain cut in sharply, "because there's no choice. Do you understand? 200 souls are strapped in. Behind you, they're counting on you. Not me, not anyone else. You." The truth of it slammed into James harder than any turbulence. Every cry he had heard in the cabin, every panicked face, every whispered prayer, they all funneled into the seat, into his hands. For years, he had been invisible, a man overlooked. Now, there was no one else to look to. His jaw tightened. His hands steadied on the controls. For the first time, he stopped thinking about what he wasn't and started thinking about what he needed to be. The storm outside flared again, lightning illuminating the cockpit in stark white. Thunder boomed close, shaking the fuselage. The aircraft dipped suddenly, alarm screaming. James's reflexes kicked in. He pulled gently on the yoke, adjusted the throttle, corrected the angle. The nose steadied, the altitude indicator leveled. The alarms dulled, the storm receded, at least for now. The captain gave him a single, firm nod. "You've just saved. Use from a dive." James's chest heaved, his body trembling with adrenaline. He wanted to laugh, to cry, to collapse, but he held steady. The intercom crackled again. A flight attendant's voice, urgent. "Captain, the passengers are panicking. What do we tell them?" The captain glanced at James, then pressed the button. His voice, though weak, carried authority. "Tell them the situation is under control. We have a man assisting in the cockpit. We are stabilizing." In the silence that followed, James's stomach churned. He knew the truth. They weren't safe yet. Not even close. But for the first time, he wasn't paralyzed by it. He was acting. He was in the fight. The captain leaned back again, his voice lower now, meant only for James. "Listen to me. Fear will eat you alive if you let it. But fear isn't our enemy. It sharpens us. Use it. Control it. That's what real pilots do." James nodded slowly, his eyes fixed on the glowing instruments. For years, he had dreamed of flight as a hobby, a fantasy. Tonight, it was no longer a dream. It was survival. And survival demanded that he become what he never thought he could be. James tightened his grip on the yoke, eyes burning with focus. The storm still raged outside. The warnings still blinked. The passengers still whispered their desperate prayers. But inside the cockpit, a man once invisible had stepped forward. And for the first time, he didn't feel like nobody. He felt like the pilot. The storm was no longer distant. It roared outside the cockpit, a furious orchestra of wind, lightning, and pounding rain that slammed against the fuselage like fists on a locked door. James could feel the tremors of nature's rage coursing. Through the yoke in his hands, every movement of the storm translating directly into violent jolts of metal and machinery. Lightning flared again, so close it painted the cockpit in blinding white. James flinched, his heartbeat pounding in his ears. The thunder that followed was immediate and brutal, shaking the plane as though some giant hand had struck it from above. "Hold her steady," the captain barked, his voice sharp, cutting through the storm's roar. "I'm trying." James shouted, pulling gently on the yoke, to correct the sudden drop in altitude. The artificial horizon spun wildly, the nose of the plane dipping toward the abyss below. His stomach flipped with the sickening sensation of descent. "Not too much," the captain snapped. "Ease her back. Small corrections. Trust the instruments, not your gut." James forced himself to breathe, eyes locked on the glowing dials. His instincts screamed that they were falling into the void, but the horizon line told a different story. They were recovering, slowly, painfully. He loosened his grip, adjusted again, and felt the aircraft stabilize just enough for his lungs to unclench. Another strike of turbulence rattled the cockpit, tossing his body against the harness. Warning alarms blared, a shrill chorus of panic. James's fingers ached from clutching the controls, but he didn't let go. The captain leaned toward him, his face drawn but steady. "Listen to me, James. The storm wants to own you. If you fight it head-on, you'll lose. You've got to work with it. Ride the currents, not against them." James nodded, sweat dripping into his eyes. He eased the yoke instead of jerking it, feeling the rhythm of the turbulence, guiding rather than resisting. Slowly, almost imperceptibly, the plane stopped bucking like a wild horse and began flowing with the air. The captain gave a tight nod. "Better, much better." The radio crackled again. "Flight 289. Radar shows you're deep in storm cells. Recommend immediate altitude adjustment. Can you comply?" James's stomach lurched. Adjust altitude? He could barely keep the plane level. His eyes flicked to the captain, searching for guidance. "You can do this," the captain said firmly. "Bring us up to 35,000 feet. Slowly. Watch the climb rate." James swallowed hard, wrapped his fingers around the throttle, and eased it forward. The engines responded with a deep roar, vibrations coursing through the floor beneath. His feet, the altimeter needle, began to climb. He pulled gently on the yoke, lifting the nose. The plane shuddered violently, as if resisting his command. James gritted his teeth, sweat pouring down his back. For a terrifying second, he thought the engines would stall, but the needle crept higher. 31,000 feet. 32. Then the storm screamed its defiance. A downdraft slammed the aircraft, sending it plummeting. Passengers screamed behind the cockpit door, their voices muffled but raw. Trays and luggage crashed in the cabin. James's chest seized with panic. His hands jerked the yoke upward, desperate to stop the fall. "Not like that," the captain roared. "You'll stall us. Ease off." James froze, realizing his mistake. His heart thundered as he steadied his grip, loosening his pull, letting the engines recover. The nose dipped less sharply, then steadied. The stall alarm silenced. "Trust her," the captain urged. "She'll climb again if you give her time." And she did. Slowly, agonizingly, the altitude ticked upward once more. 33,000. 34. Finally, 35. James exhaled a shaky breath, his chest heaving as though he'd run a marathon. His arms trembled, muscles burning from the tension. The captain gave him a sideways glance, the faintest ghost of a smile on his pale face. "You just wrestled a storm cell and won." James shook his head, still panting. "I nearly killed us." "But you didn't," the captain said simply. "That's what matters." The storm outside hadn't disappeared. Lightning still flashed, rain still battered the fuselage, but something had shifted. James no longer felt like a passenger trapped at the mercy of the skies. He was an active part of the fight, guiding, correcting, enduring. Behind the cockpit door, the cries of panic began to quiet, replaced by a tense silence. The passengers, though terrified, could sense the difference. The plane wasn't diving anymore. It wasn't lurching like a falling stone. Someone, the man from row 11, was keeping it alive. A voice broke the silence. Air traffic control again. Flight 289, you're holding steady. Good work. Weather ahead is still rough, but radar shows clearer skies if you can maintain course another 40 miles. 40 miles. To James, it might as well have been 1,000. His arms felt like lead, his throat parched, his mind screaming with exhaustion. But quitting wasn't an option. Not while hundreds of lives depended on him. The captain seemed to sense the weight pressing down on him. His voice softened, steady but encouraging. 40 miles isn't forever. It's one correction after another. Don't think about the finish line. Just think about the next second, the next adjustment. Piece by piece, you'll get us there. James nodded faintly, gripping the yoke tighter. The storm raged on, but he leaned into the rhythm. Now, moving with the turbulence, guiding the plane like a sailor steering through waves. Every flash of lightning, every groan of the engines, every flicker of alarms tested him, but he stayed steady. His body trembled with fatigue, yet his mind sharpened with each passing minute. Somewhere in the chaos, he realized something profound. For the first time in his life, he wasn't invisible. He wasn't the nobody in row 11. He was the line between survival and tragedy, the one holding back the abyss. And though fear still gnawed at him, another feeling began to rise: determination. The storm ahead flashed with another burst of lightning, illuminating James's face in stark relief. His jaw was set, his eyes fierce, his hands steady. He was no longer just surviving the storm. He was conquering it. The worst of the storm had passed, but the danger was far from over. The plane still trembled as it cut through unsettled air, like a wounded animal limping toward shelter. James could see the distant glow of Los Angeles lights shimmering faintly, below, blurred by lingering clouds and streaks of rain. Relief should have washed over him, but instead, dread pooled in his stomach. He had gotten them through the sky, barely, but the true test lay ahead, landing. "All right, James," the captain said, his voice lower now, strained but steady. "The hard part isn't over. Getting her down is the real challenge." James's throat was bone dry. His hands trembled on the yoke. "I don't know if I can do this," he admitted, his voice cracking. "You can," the captain replied sharply. "You've gotten us this far. I'll talk you through every step. But it's your hands on the controls. Understand?" James swallowed hard, his Adam's apple bobbing. He gave a faint nod. "The radio?" Crackled. "Flight 289, we have you on radar. You are cleared to approach runway 25 left. Emergency services are standing by." Emergency services? Fire trucks, ambulances. The very words tightened James's chest. They were preparing for the worst. The captain tapped the altimeter. "First, start bringing us down. Reduce thrust, slowly, and lower the nose. Keep your descent controlled." James gripped the throttle, easing it back. The engine's roar softened, and the plane began to dip. His stomach lurched as the descent began. His eyes flicked. Across the glowing panel, instruments blurring from sheer nerves. "Eyes on the vertical speed indicator," the captain instructed. "Keep the descent around 700 feet per minute. Too fast and we'll slam. Too slow and we'll overshoot." James tried to focus, tried to breathe, but his pulse hammered in his ears. The numbers danced. The plane shuddered as crosswinds batted against the wings. "Correct, James. Small adjustments," the captain said. "Trust the instruments." James adjusted, tiny movements, his fingers aching with effort. The plane steadied. The descent rate held steady. A flicker of hope sparked, but then the cabin shook violently. Air pockets sent them dropping like an elevator cut loose. Gasps and screams rose from behind the cockpit door. James's hands flew across the yoke. "Don't overcorrect." The captain barked. James forced himself to loosen his grip, heart pounding. He steadied the plane once more, but fear was eating him alive. The captain's voice cut through. Listen to me. Fear is normal, but right now, fear won't save them. Focus will. You are not a passenger anymore, James. You are the pilot. Act like it. The words hit him like a spark to dry wood. Something shifted inside him, not the absence of fear, but the determination to rise above it. He nodded, jaw tight. All right, let's do this. The descent continued. Clouds thinned, revealing the sprawl of Los Angeles below. Glittering highways, clusters of lights, tiny dots of cars. Somewhere down there, a strip of asphalt waited, to either save or destroy them. Gear down, the captain ordered. James's hand hovered over the lever. He pulled. A deep mechanical groan rattled the fuselage as the landing gear extended. He glanced at the indicator. 3 green lights glowed. Gear down and locked. Flaps 15, the captain said. James fumbled for the lever, pushed it. The plane responded, wings adjusting, flaps lowering. The descent slowed, stabilized. The runway lights appeared ahead, twin rows of glowing guidance in the night. James's breath caught. It looked so impossibly narrow, like threading a needle while blindfolded. You're lined up, the captain said, voice calm, deliberate. Keep her steady. Follow the glide slope. Not too high, not too low. James's eyes flicked between the glowing poppy lights and the instruments. His hands trembled, but he kept correcting, small adjustments, fighting to stay aligned. The city lights grew brighter. The runway loomed closer. 5 miles, the captain sighed. You're doing good. The radio came alive again. Flight 289. Wind shear warning reported on final approach. Caution advised. James's stomach clenched. Wind shear? The captain's eyes darkened. Sudden shifts. In wind speed and direction. Dangerous this close to the ground. You'll need to be sharp. As if on cue, the plane jolted sideways, wind slamming into it. The runway shifted off-center. Alarms blared. Passengers screamed again. James's chest seized. He jerked the yoke instinctively, fighting to realign. Steady. The captain barked. Don't fight too hard. Gentle corrections. James forced his movements smaller, controlled. Slowly, painfully, the nose aligned again with the runway. 3 miles. 2 miles. The runway lights now stretched directly beneath them, rushing up with terrifying speed. James's whole body shook with tension. I don't know if I can. You can. The captain cut him off, eyes on the threshold. Hold your glide. Trust me. 1 mile. The radio crackled. Flight 289, cleared to land. Emergency crews standing by. The cockpit filled with alarms as turbulence hit again. The plane wobbled, altitude wavering. James's knuckles turned white. Ease back, the captain instructed. Ease back. Keep her nose level. Throttle. Gently. James obeyed, heart hammering. The runway numbers rushed toward them. 50 feet, the captain called. Eyes ahead. James's breath froze. His hands moved without thought, easing back on the yoke, reducing throttle. 30 feet, the ground loomed. His vision tunneled. 20, the engines whined. The plane bucked, wind tearing. 10, James pulled gently, praying. Every nerve in his body screaming. The wheels slammed into the tarmac with bone-rattling force. The plane bounced and hit again, harder. Hold her steady. The captain barked. James clutched the yoke, fighting the wobble. Tires screeched. Smoke billowed. He jammed the brakes, reversed thrust. The plane roared, shuddered, screamed across the runway. Lights blurred past. For a moment, James thought they wouldn't stop. But then, slowing. The engines howled in reverse, brakes squealing, until finally, mercifully, the plane screeched to a halt near the end of the runway. Silence. For a long moment, the world held its breath. Then, from behind the cockpit door, the sound began. Cheers, sobs, clapping. The raw outpouring of relief from hundreds of lives that had been teetering on the edge. James sat frozen, chest heaving, drenched in sweat. His hands wouldn't let go of the yoke. He wasn't sure they ever could. The captain exhaled heavily, placing a trembling hand on James's shoulder. "You did it." James shook his head in disbelief. "No, we did it." The captain gave him a tired smile. "Maybe. So, but remember, when they tell the story, it was the man in row 11 who brought them home." The cabin remained silent for several long seconds after the plane came to a complete stop. The silence was heavy, almost unreal, as though everyone on board was afraid to believe they had actually survived. Then, slowly, the quiet cracked. A sob, a laugh, then an eruption of clapping, cheers, and cries that spread through the fuselage like wildfire. James sat frozen in the cockpit, drenched in sweat, his heart still galloping. His hands clung to the yoke as though letting go would undo the miracle that had just unfolded. His body trembled violently, every muscle wrung dry from the sheer tension of the landing. The captain removed his headset and leaned back, shoulders sagging. His face was pale, but his eyes burned with relief. He placed a hand on James's shoulder. "You did what most trained men would have faltered at," he said hoarsely. "Don't ever forget that." James swallowed, trying to speak, but no words came. He simply nodded, blinking back tears he hadn't realized were welling up. The cockpit door opened, and a flight attendant burst in, her face streaked with tears. "We made it," she whispered, her voice breaking. "My God, we actually made it." She glanced at James, as though seeing him for the first time. You saved us." Behind her, the sound of passengers cheering grew louder. Some were chanting, others were praying aloud, and many simply cried into each other's shoulders. What had been a cabin of fear only minutes ago was now a cabin of pure, unfiltered gratitude. James rose shakily, legs unsteady, and followed the crew into the main cabin. Every head turned toward him. Passengers stood in their seats, clapping, crying, shouting his name, even though most hadn't known it until that moment. A woman in the front row reached out and grabbed his hand, sobbing. "Thank you. You saved my children." Another man hugged him tightly, his voice choked. "You're a hero, son. A damn hero." James felt overwhelmed, as though the weight of their gratitude was heavier than the plane itself. He wanted to tell them he wasn't a hero, that he wasn't even a real pilot, that he had been terrified every second. But their faces lit with relief and admiration, silenced him. The emergency vehicles swung around the plane outside. Red and blue lights strobed against the windows as fire trucks, ambulances, and police cars encircled the jet. The air stairs rolled into place, and the crew began ushering passengers off in an orderly fashion. When James stepped onto the stairway, the cool night air hit his face. A roar of cheers erupted from the ground below. Airport staff, emergency crews, even reporters who had already gathered on the tarmac, all erupted into applause. Cameras flashed. Voices shouted questions he couldn't even hear over the commotion. He squinted against the lights, stunned by the chaos. Only hours ago, he had been just another weary traveler in row 11. Now, people were chanting his name. He descended slowly, every step surreal, until his feet touched solid ground. A paramedic rushed forward, pressing a bottle of water into his hand. "Sir, are you all right? Do you need medical assistance?" James shook his head numbly. "I'm fine. Just..." tired. The captain was escorted down behind him, supported by 2 attendants, his leg injury making him limp. As soon as the crowd caught sight of him, the applause rose again. But many eyes kept returning to James, the unassuming passenger who had done the impossible. Reporters swarmed closer, microphones shoved toward his face. "Sir, how did you land the plane? Were you a pilot before? What was going through your mind during the landing?" James blinked, overwhelmed. He opened his mouth, searching for words. I just did what needed to be done." He finally managed, his voice soft. The real credit goes to the captain, to the crew, to everyone who stayed calm. I only did what anyone would have tried to do. But the reporters weren't interested in humility. They pressed closer, scribbling feverishly, recording every syllable. In their headlines, he was already cemented as the passenger who saved Flight 289. The passengers, however, carried the truth in their eyes. To them, James wasn't just a man with luck on his side. He was the difference between life and death. As buses transported survivors to the terminal, James sat quietly in the back, staring out the window. His hands still tingled, the ghost of the controls lingering in his muscles. Every time he blinked, he saw the runway rushing toward him again, the violent jolt of the wheels hitting asphalt. Inside the terminal, chaos reigned. Families clutched each other, crying and laughing at once. News crews filmed live broadcasts, shouting into cameras about the miracle landing. Police officers struggled to maintain order as crowds swelled. James tried to slip through unnoticed, but a group of passengers spotted him. They swarmed him, hugging him, thanking him again and again. Some knelt as if in reverence. One little boy clung to his leg, whispering, "You're my hero." James knelt, ruffling the boy's hair with trembling fingers. "No, buddy. The real hero is your mom for keeping you brave up there." But the boy just shook his head, eyes shining. By the time James finally made it to a quiet corner of the terminal, his legs felt like lead. He sank into a chair, burying his face in his hands. Exhaustion swept over him in a tidal wave. The captain hobbled over, lowering himself carefully into the seat beside him. For a moment, neither spoke. Then the captain sighed. "You'll never be just a passenger again, James. What you did tonight, it'll live longer than either of us." James lifted his head, eyes heavy. "I don't want fame. I don't want cameras. I just wanted everyone to make it home." The captain smiled faintly. "And that's exactly why they'll remember you." Hours later, James finally walked out of the airport into the cool Los Angeles morning. The horizon was painted with a first blush of dawn. His clothes were wrinkled, his body drained, but his spirit was oddly still. The city bustled around him, unaware of the extraordinary battle that had been fought in its skies only hours before. People rushed to work, taxis honked, life carried on. And James, the man who had been nobody in row 11, blended back into it quietly. But something had changed inside him. He had faced fear, stared it in the eye, and walked away with hundreds of lives intact. He didn't know what tomorrow would bring. Interviews, headlines, perhaps even opportunities he could never imagine. For now, though, he simply closed his eyes, took a long breath, and let the truth settle in. He had been terrified, unqualified, and uncertain every step of the way. And yet, somehow, when it mattered most, he had been enough. That, he realized, was the real miracle.